But as we get started, some reminders of something we need to keep in our prayers. Crystal McIntosh, she was checked on again, and she's still in a whole lot of pain. And it seems like it's really bad. She was saying she wished she hadn't gotten the surgery. It's that bad. So definitely keep her in your prayers. I've got her address on the PowerPoint. It'd be good if we sent her some cards. So if you can, write her address down and send her a few things when that starts scrolling again this morning. But definitely keep her in your prayers. Sherry Edwards, she's having her procedure done Thursday at UAB, so keep her in your prayers for sure with that procedure and everything with that. And of course, the ladies that are gone, we need to remember them, make sure that they're safe. Is there anyone else we need to mention this morning? All right, let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, great and holy art thou. Father, we're thankful unto thee for the day that thou hast blessed us with and the opportunity we had to study from thy word. Father, we want to lift up those that we mentioned this morning, and Sherry Edwards, as she's about to go through her procedure. Father, be with her, that procedure will go well. Be with the doctors and nurses that will be caring for her. Father, grant them wisdom in their field that they'll be able to do those things that will help her to get better. Father, be with the ladies that are traveling. Father, make sure that we ask that they would have safe travels as they're traveling, Father. Father, also be with Crystal McIntosh as she's still struggling from her surgery. Father, we ask that pain will be able to be relieved. Father, that as she goes to have more checkups on this, that those doctors and nurses will be able to do those things for her, that will be able to help take that pain away. Father, we're so thankful unto thee for all thy many blessings, for the love that thou hast shown us, for this opportunity we have to come and study from thy word. Father, we love thee. So thankful unto thee for thy Son, who sent to die in our stead. It's in his name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, so we are in Jeremiah chapter 2. Okay, so we finished chapter 1. Remember, we were discussing Jeremiah and how he received this call to be a prophet, and he accepted that call. And then God, at the end of chapter 1, began to strengthen him and to tell him that, Jeremiah, I need you to be strong. I need you to have a backbone. You're going to have a lot of people against you. Basically, it's going to be you versus the nation. Okay, but then God said, remember that I am with thee. Okay, he told Jeremiah, don't worry. I'm going to be with you. You stay faithful. You stay strong. I'm going to be with you every step of the way. And so that leads us into chapter 2. So Jeremiah 2 and verse number 1, moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying. So again, Jeremiah assures us his message is from God. And we're going to see this over and over and over and over again as we see Jeremiah constantly repeat the word of the Lord came unto him. So we know that it's not Jeremiah's message, but it is a message from God. But verse number 2, he says, go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, thus saith the Lord, I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness, in a land that was not sown. So notice what God begins to do with this message that he wants Jeremiah to preach. He wants Jeremiah, I want you to go to Jerusalem. Okay, he doesn't mean go and talk to the physical city. He's talking about the people here. Go to Jerusalem and preach to the people that are there. But notice what he had to do. He had to get up out of Anathoth, his homeland, and go where the message was needed. Okay, he said, Jeremiah, get up, leave Anathoth, go to Jerusalem. So where was he going? He was going to the capital, right? He was going to the center of Judah. He was going to where the corruption was at its worst. So how would you like if you had to go and preach a message or to talk to someone about the gospel and you had to go to the very center of where the sin was? I don't know if I'd be too excited. But that's exactly what God told Jeremiah to do. He didn't tell him start on the outskirts and work your way in. He said, Jeremiah, you go to the center. You go where all of this is starting from and you preach there. You go to Jerusalem. But notice what God begins with. His message starts with, Judah, I remember when you were a young nation. I remember when you actually loved me. Okay? He says, I remember when you had dedicated yourself to me when you were a young nation. See, God had made them his bride. They were his special people. And he remembers that. He remembers their espousals, that marriage relationship, how they were glad to be his people for a little while. Hey, but he remembered that. He remembered how they sought him to sustain them. But then what happened? They started to go and get away from God, and that generation arose that knew not God. Someone read Judges chapter 2, verses 6 through 10 for us. Judges 2, 6 through 10. Remember what had happened. The people were in the wilderness. They needed God. They went through the land, the promised land, and they got all that conquered and taken care of. And then things got really good for them. And notice what happened when things got good. Judges 2, 6 through 10.
When Joshua dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went to serve the inheritance of the land. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the territory of his inheritance from Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gad. And all in that generation also were gathered to the fathers, and there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel.
All right, so notice what happened. You had Joshua. Okay, you had Moses first. Moses passed away. He passed the torch to Joshua. Joshua, of course, he led the people through the promised land, through all those conquerings and things like that. But they were faithful all through the time of Joshua. And then they were even faithful through all the times of the elders that were there with him. But whenever Joshua and the elders and that whole faithful generation passed away, what happened? There arose a generation that knew not God. Now that's interesting because that tells us a couple of things. Number one is that during the time where the times were a little bit tougher, the people needed God, they were faithful to God. So we've already talked about that before. But not only that, what happens if parents don't teach their children about God? They forget God. There arises a generation that knows not the Lord. And that's exactly what happened there, is that you have these people who were faithful to God, but somewhere in between there, they didn't procure those teachings to their children. And what happened is you have an offspring, a generation that didn't know God. They should have been taught these things. Remember, whenever they crossed the Jordan River into the promised land, Joshua said, go and gather 12 stones and put them at the edge of the river. And whenever you cross by there again, your children are going to ask you, what are those stones all about? And you're supposed to take time to stop and teach them. This is where God stopped the Jordan and we crossed this river. Remember all the great things God has done for us. That's what they were supposed to do with their children, was to teach them, to let them remember what God had done. But somewhere in there that didn't happen. And so you had a generation that rose that knew not God, but God is remembering that past time. He's going back saying, I remember when you were faithful to me. I remember that time that you loved me and needed me. But they learned how to be devoted to God. Notice in that wilderness wandering, he says that he had that love about his espousals when they went after him in the wilderness. Okay, so you remember initially the children of Israel, did they want to go into the promised land or not? No, they said there's giants there. There's these giant men. We're like grasshoppers to them. Yeah, the land is good, but we're scared. Now you remember who are the two that said we can do it? Joshua and Caleb. They said, no, let's go. We've got God on our side. We can take this land. But at first, they feared to go in. And remember what happened because of their fear. They then had to go and wander the wilderness for 40 years. Okay, that generation had to pass away that was fearful. Now, as soon as they left and had to start wandering, they said, oh, now, let's go back and take the promised land now. We don't want to wander in the wilderness. God said it's too late. You're going to wander in the wilderness. So they do this wandering. Remember, God feeds feeds them with the manna. He feeds them with the quail. You got the waters and everything like that. God provided for them while they were wandering through the wilderness. Now, of course, the Israelites, at times they trusted in God and things like that. Other times they questioned God. Why'd you bring us to the wilderness? All that type of stuff. But finally, whenever Joshua came around, in Joshua chapter 3, they finally are ready to enter into the land after that time is finally passed of their wandering. And after that wandering, now they're ready to go into the land. And Joshua chapter 3 talks about when that river was pushed up, that it was stopped so that the children of Israel could cross the waters and go into the promised land. But they learned we need to trust in God there in the wilderness. Okay, they doubted God at the start. That caused them to have to wander for 40 years. Through all that, they then went back to trust in God. It's kind of the same thing with the captivities. Why did God allow His people to go into captivity for 70 years? But they had left Him. They had denied Him. And then what happened after they came out? Were they more attached to God or less attached?
They never served idols.
Yeah, they never served idols again. The captivity actually cleansed them from idol worship. They never served idols again. Now they had other problems. You had the Pharisees and things like that. They got really into tradition and legalism and things like that. But idol worship was gone. Okay, so what did these times of trouble do for them? It brought them back to God. But God says, I remember when you were faithful to me in those hard times. But notice verse number 3 now. Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the firstfruits of his increase. All that devour him shall offend, evil shall come upon them, saith the Lord. So notice, Israel was a holiness to God. This means that they were set aside by God, and their lives were supposed to be for God. Okay, so they were actually set apart for God. They were a holiness to God. They were His first fruits. This means that they belonged to Him just like the first fruits belong to the priest. You can read Ezekiel 44 and verse 30 and see there how the first fruits were supposed to go to the priest. Okay, you offer the first fruits of some things to God, and they offer those as a burnt offering, but then some of those first fruits were actually eaten by the priests. Okay, so just like those first fruits went to the priest, they were the first fruits of God. Okay, they were that special crop that was His. They were dedicated. They were holy for Him. Notice they were in a protected state. He said that any that try to devour them shall offend, and evil will come upon them that try to hurt them. So notice they were in a protected state, and they were assured that their enemies would be devoured by God, that they would be taken by God. So notice this is all Israel's past history. Okay, so these first 3 verses, this was Israel's past. This is what they used to be like. Okay, they used to be faithful to God. They used to be His holiness, His first fruits, His protected people. But now notice as we go in these next few verses where they are now. Okay, that was the past. Now listen to the present of Judah. Verse number 4. Hear ye the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. So notice, it makes no difference here. He says to the house of Jacob, to all the families of Israel. This message was for all the Israelites. It was for all of them. It didn't matter if you were a king. It didn't matter if you were poor. It didn't matter if you were a priest. This was for everyone. Okay, this message was for all of the Israelites. This was for everyone. And this is kind of interesting because you think with Israel, right now at this point we're in Judah, and Judah only has those 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. But you got those other 10 tribes that were taken by Assyria. But notice what God says here. Even those 10 tribes that have been taken already, still you need to listen to. This is for all the families of Israel. Not just Judah. This is for everyone. So tribes that have already been taken, you need to listen to. And that lets us know, and we're going to see this as we go through Jeremiah, that this message didn't just stay in one spot. It was spread about. Okay? It wasn't just like Jeremiah preached this message in Jerusalem and then that was the end of it. This message was taken and spread throughout the country, and later on we're going to see after Judah's taken captive that Jeremiah actually takes his message and writes it to the people in captivity too, and helps spread that message. He says, you guys need to know this. Okay, so we're not in a closed system. Okay, this message was going to go to all the families of the house of Israel. They all needed to hear this. Okay, this message was for all of them. Notice verse number 5. Thus saith the Lord. What's this message? What iniquity have your fathers found in me, that they are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and are become vain. So notice what happens here. Notice God's fidelity here. Okay? He has His fidelity. God's got His fidelity, His trustworthiness, His holiness, and He's going to contrast it with Judah's foolishness, with their rebellion, with everything like that. So the question is, does God ever break a promise? No. Notice what He asks them. What iniquity, the Young's Literal says, what perversity. The ASV says, what unrighteousness have you found in me? Well, the answer to that is, what could they find in God in that? They couldn't. Okay, God's going to keep all of His promise. What He's saying here is, Judah, you have no excuse. You cannot find evil in God. Okay, your ancestors couldn't do it. You can't do it. Okay, they had abandoned their God who loved them. Okay, they should have been walking after God, but instead they went after these other gods, which were vanity. They're literally emptiness. They're nothingness, is what an idol truly is. But notice what God said again. He said, what iniquity, what unrighteousness did you find in me? And of course the answer there is none. Okay, we know that God is light from 1 John. We know that James 1:17 says that God is where all the good gifts come from, no bad gifts. God's not the one who tempts man with sin. Okay, man is tempted and drawn away of his own lust, according to James. So we know that there's no unrighteousness with God. But notice what happened. Judah started to serve these idols. They walked after vanity, idol worship, and became vain themselves. They became empty. Okay, they became just as empty as those idols that they worshipped. And that's kind of sad, isn't it? When you start to serve something so much, you become like it. Does that ever happen today? You ever notice people who strive and go after money? What do they start to do? A good person all of a sudden starts to cheat a little. Starts to steal some from here and there. Starts to become crooked. Starts to make dark deals with people. What happened? He became like what he was after. He became like that money. Okay, searching for it, driving it. These people had come like idols. Okay, idols were emptiness. They were nothingness. And the people had tried to fill themselves with that, and instead they became empty themselves. Okay, they couldn't fill that hole with idols. It could only be filled with God. So notice verse number 6. Neither said they, where is the Lord that brought us up out of the land of Egypt? Notice, they weren't even looking for God anymore. They said they weren't asking, where is the Lord that led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and of pits, through a land of drought and of the shadow of death, through a land that no man passed through, and where no man dwelt. So notice, they had such ingratitude for God that they were not even asking for Him anymore. They weren't even asking or looking for the God who had brought them out of the Egyptian bondage, the one who had led them through the wasteland of pits and droughts, the one that had led them through these times of wilderness covered in death's shadow, a land where no one would dwell because it could not sustain life. They had left God. They weren't even looking for Him anymore. But you remember those wilderness wanderings, all these things he's talking about here, all this wilderness and land of drought and everything. What had God done every step of the way? He had watered them. He had fed them. He had protected them. And yet now they're at the point where they're not even asking where God is anymore. And that's a sad, sad situation to be in. You know what starts all of this? Ingratitude. Someone read Romans 1, 20 and 21. Romans 1, 20 and 21. Ingratitude is what started all this. And it starts it for us today as well. Romans 1, 20 and 21.
For the invisible things of him since the creation of the world are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even his everlasting power and divinity, that they may be without excuse, because that knowing God, they glorified him not as God, neither gave him thanks, but became vain in their reasonings, and their senseless hearts was darkened.
So notice what God had done. He had clearly set forth himself. Okay, talking about the Gentiles here. Okay, about during those times of the patriarchs and things like that. God had clearly revealed himself. But notice what happened. They knew God was there. He was clearly seen in the creation. But neither gave them thanks. They became ungrateful. Ingratitude started that idol worship. And what happened, you remember the patriarchs. Okay, you had all these heads of the families who God spoke to directly, like Job and Noah and Abraham and people like that. But what happened to most of the nations after the flood? Okay, they started to do what? Serve idols, right? Most of them. I mean, Ammonites, Moabites, whatever it was, they started to serve idols. Very few remained faithful to God. And that verse tells us what happened. That they became ungrateful. They stopped giving thanks to God. They knew God was there. He was clearly seen, verse 20. But then it got to the point where they stopped thanking God, and it led to idol worship. So that's a warning for us today. What happens when we start thanking God for the things we have? It leads us to a bad situation, doesn't it? Leads us to thinking that maybe I'm the one that did that. Remember we talked about that not too long ago. I'm the one who did that. Remember Hosea and Gomer. Gomer thought that she was the one taking care of herself, but really it was Hosea the whole time. Same thing with us today. We may think that we're trying to take care of ourselves, that we're doing this. We stop thanking God, and it leads us to some bad, dark places. But it all starts with ingratitude. That's where it started with Judah as well. They had loved God. They had worshipped Him. They were faithful to Him. But then they got ungrateful. They stopped thanking God when things got good. And now look at where they are now. Full of idol worship. About to be taken into captivity. Corrupt from the head to the foot. All these things. But look at verse 7. Remember verse 6, they had not asked for God. Verse 7, and I brought you into a plentiful country to eat the fruit thereof and the goodness thereof. But when ye entered, ye defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. So notice what happened. God says, I brought you into a good land. Remember the description of that land. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, was that literal milk and honey? Not likely. It was just a figure of speech to show that it was a good land, plentiful. You remember they got that cluster of grapes and it took 2 men to bear it on their shoulders to bring it back. Okay, it was a good land. It was a plentiful land. God says, I brought you there into the goodness and the fruit thereof. But when they entered, they defiled it and made his heritage an abomination. So notice, this had to happen over a generation or two. We already noticed that. Joshua led the people in, and then within 1 generation, the people forgot God. Notice how bad ingratitude is. Whenever you start to lose that thankfulness for God, it doesn't happen, it doesn't take a very long time before you start to really get away from God. Okay, it only took them 1 generation. God had promised to bring their ancestors into Canaan, and He did just that. He brought them in. It was that land of milk and honey, yet Israel was not grateful. And what did they do? They defiled the land with idolatry. They took all these idols of the different people around them, and they brought in all these idols and made his heritage an abomination to God. They acted just indifferent towards God, towards his prophet, towards his law. All these different things, they just simply left God. Okay, but God had brought them into this plentiful land, and then they turned around and left God. And I keep coming back to this, but the book of Jeremiah reminds me of the U.S. so much today. I mean, it really does. I mean, the state that they are in, where they were, it all just sounds so familiar. Remember, with the United States, we came to this land, and it was a good land. Okay, there was freedom here. There was the opportunity to do what we wanted to do, to worship freely as well. And we won that independence from Britain at that time, and we trusted in God still to kind of help that nation along, but times were still tough. Okay, and it was tough for a long time. And then you get into our more modern culture, where kind of everything's a little bit at ease. Everything's really good right now. And what turns around and happens? We forget God. We stop being grateful to God. And once we stop being grateful to God, we forget God. Once we forget God, we leave God. And that's exactly what's happening today. Jeremiah reminds me so much of the United States today. And if that's any description of us today, we need to be really careful at the end of Jeremiah. Because it doesn't end well for Judah. And if the United States continues on the path it is, I don't think it's going to end well for us either. So we need to be very careful and take a lesson from Jeremiah. But verse number 8, the priest said not, where is the Lord? Notice their priests weren't even asking for God. What happens when the preachers stop asking for God? It's not good. And they that handle the law knew me not. The ones that had God's law didn't even know the one who wrote it. And that's a terrible thing. The pastors, the shepherds, also transgressed against me, and the prophets prophesied by Baal, and walked after things that did not profit. So notice what happened here in this verse. One of their biggest problems was that their leaders were corrupt. Okay, the priests, the ones who were their connection to God, they weren't even making an effort to seek God anymore. And when you have your connection to God no longer seeking God, then you don't have God. So their priests weren't even seeking God. Those that read the law, those that were supposed to read God's law and tell it to the people and make sure they were following it, did not even know the God that wrote it. They didn't even know Him anymore. And yet they read His law. Their pastors, these civil rulers, this was like their kings and princes, they led the people in transgression. They didn't lead them in truth. He says their pastors transgressed against me. Their kings and princes, instead of leading the people in truth, they were leading them in transgression. Do you remember the rule that God made for them to have a king? He said, I don't want you to have a king. All you need is me. But the people said, we want a king, we want a king, we want a king. And God made a very specific rule that's kind of interesting for the king. You remember what he had to write at least once in his kingship? He had to write the law, word for word. He had to write his own copy of it to make sure that he was close to God. But if your leaders are transgressing against him, what did they stop doing? They stopped writing the law. They stopped following it. They stopped keeping it. And what happened? They instead led the people in transgression. They were supposed to lead the people in truth. They were supposed to know the truth, yet they stopped doing that. They went after these things that did not profit rather than those things which did. Okay, so again, what kind of attitude starts this? Ingratitude. Stop thanking God, and that leads to this. They had completely given up their mission by God to be God's special people among the nations. Someone read 1 Samuel 8, 4 and 5 for us. 1 Samuel 8, verses 4 and 5. They were supposed to be God's special people, a beacon of light among the nations. 1 Samuel 8, 4 and 5.
And all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel in Ramah and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king, judge us like all the nations.
So notice what happened there. Samuel, you're getting old. Remember, Samuel's sons, they didn't even follow God. Okay, they were wicked men. So notice what they said. They said, give us a king. But what was that king that they wanted? What did they say at the end of the verse there? Give us a king like who? Like all the nations. They didn't say, give us a king that would be like God, who would follow God. They said, give us a king like all the other nations. Remember, Israel was chosen to be a beacon of light. They were chosen to be different from the nations. Yet, what did they want their king to be? Just like the nations. And the sad thing is God said, okay, you want a king like the nations? And he actually gave them, here's what your kings are going to do to you. And he gave this long list of terrible things about them taking their children off to wars, about raising their taxes, about taking things from them, about leading them into destruction. And yet they still wanted that king. And all those things that God said their king would do to them, it all happened. You read through all those evil, wicked kings of Israel, some of them in Judah, and all those things that God talked about all happened. And yet that's the king they wanted. And that's a sad, sad thing indeed. Yes, sir, Stephen.
I take a look at it this way, when they wanted a king, what they were looking for, see, God was ruling from the tabernacle at that time. The presence of God was in the tabernacle.
Right.
Most of the people couldn't go in the tabernacle. They were forbidden. Only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. What they were wanting was something physical that they could see.
Right.
The other nations had a king that was physical. You could go to the king for your problems. They couldn't go directly to God. They had to go through priests or they had sacrifices. They wanted to be able to go directly to be able to see that king.
Right.
And they wanted to be able to, to them that was their security, I guess.
Right. Yeah, they definitely.
They had lost faith in the God they could not see, although they had seen a lot of the miracles that he had done.
Right. Yeah, they've definitely done all that, and they definitely wanted that physical king. You could see that, of course, then with Israel just always had that problem. They wanted something material. They wanted something on earth. I mean, you see that with the kingdom in the New Testament. We've talked about this before, but they kept asking Jesus, are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel now? And the answer was no. It's a spiritual kingdom. Yeah, they definitely wanted something physical, a physical king on earth. They had God. They knew God. And like you said, they had seen the miracles and things like that. They could also see you had that the Shekinah, the flame and cloud that was above the tabernacle. Whenever God's presence was there, you had that flame that was above the tabernacle and everything like that. And when it would get up and move, when the tabernacle needed to move and all of that, so they could see all that stuff as well. But they wanted that physical man. They wanted someone that they could relate to. Do you remember whenever God talked to them out of the mount to Moses, and Moses came down, and they heard the thunderings and all that on the mountain, they were fearful of God. God was way up there. He was something to be feared, not in a reverential fear, but an actual fear. And what they wanted then, they wanted someone who's more like them. They wanted someone a little bit less scary, someone a little bit less fearful, someone that they could relate to in that way. They wanted that physical king for sure. And of course, that's what people have always wanted. But now the good news is that we've got Jesus the Christ who came in physical flesh and walked as a man and as God here on the earth. And so we have that connection now. We've got the one who we can relate to, the one who's been where we've been. That also comes with some stipulations as well. We can't tell Christ in judgment that you don't know where I've been. You don't know what I've done. You don't understand temptation, because he does. And so there's kind of a twofold coin there. But yeah, they wanted that, but they had these leaders who were corrupt. But verse number 9, notice, wherefore I will yet plead with you, saith the Lord, and with your children's children will I plead with you. This literally means he's going to lay a charge at their feet. The ASV says, I'm going to contend with you. Okay, so notice, the greater Judah's rebellion was, the greater was God's plea for them. He wanted them back. He wanted them to be his people. He says, you've left me, you're rebelling against me, yet will I plead with you. I still want you, Judah. Judah's not going to be able to say that God didn't warn them or try to get them back. God sent his prophets early and often, okay, and to come and give the message to the people to come back to him. They couldn't say, God, you didn't try to warn us. Okay, whenever Babylon comes, they couldn't say, God, you didn't warn us about this, because God had. He had spent so much time trying to win them back. And notice how far this plea goes. It goes beyond them to even their children and their children's children. This is how much God wanted them back. But also that tells us something as well, that God's vengeance also goes beyond this one generation into the coming generations as well. Remember, they're going to go into captivity, and Jeremiah later on in the book is actually going to tell them, go ahead and build houses, get married, have children, because you're going to be there a while. You're going to be there for 70 years. The false prophets were saying, don't do those things. You're coming back in a couple of years, but Jeremiah said, no, you go get married, have children, all of that. So they would be bringing children up in this captivity. So notice that his vengeance kind of goes past that as well. Now, the thing here is, does the sin of the parents pass to the children? No, Ezekiel 18:20 tells us it doesn't. Okay, it tells us the sins of the father are his sins, the sins of the child are his sins. Okay, so we know it doesn't pass that way. But can you feel the effects of someone else's sins? If I have a drunk father who abuses me, did I sin? But what happened? I have to suffer the consequences. But I don't have his sin on me. But I can still feel the consequences of his sin. That's what Judah's children would have. They weren't the ones who did the sinning, but they still felt the consequences. They're still being raised in captivity because of their parents' sin. Okay, so that's what's being talked about there, is that it wasn't the children's sin, but it was actually their parents, but you can still feel those consequences.
You know, Jason, they did a study out, it's been several years ago, I was reading about it, where, like, children usually follow after their parents.
Right.
I mean, if they're going to be doctors or Christians or whatever, thieves or whatever, they usually follow after.
Right. Yeah, so... Yeah, like Clifton's saying, is that whenever you see children today, the studies show that children are going to do what their parents did. So you've got someone who drinks or whatever it is heavily like that, most likely their child's going to do that as well. You can also have the opposite effect where it turns the child off of it. That can happen as well, but that's a lot less likely. But yeah, they're going to follow in the footsteps of their parents, most likely. And you look at your parents, and you look at yourself, do you have any of their characteristics? Any of their mannerisms or idiosyncrasies, whatever you want to call it? A lot of times whenever we're young, we say, I'm never going to be like my parents. And then once you get older and you have children of your own, you say, I sound like my mom, or I sound like my dad when I say that. So yeah, you pick up on things that your parents do, for sure. And that can go with the bad, too. Your parents have done something bad, that's in their lives, and it's likely that you'll do that as well. And of course, we can get into a long discussion with that. But let's go on to verse number 10 as we finish up this morning. For pass over the isles of Kittim and see, and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there be such a thing. So notice what happens here. God challenges his people. Okay, look out at Kittim. Your version may say Cyprus, and that's exactly what it is. Cyprus is over here in the Mediterranean Sea. And that's what Kittim is. That's Cyprus. So he says, look out to Cyprus, look out to Kittim, and see if they've done this type of evil. Okay, so that's kind of representation of all the west. Then he also says, look at Kedar. And Kedar was down here in the southeast of from Israel. So notice they're down there in the desert to the southeast by the Red Sea. And so that would represent everyone to the east. So what God's telling them is, Judah, look to the west, look to the east. Has anyone done such a thing as you have done? Now that's a challenge. Because what God is asking them is, look at all the pagan nations. Have any of them done as much evil as you have done? Okay, Judah, you left your God. You look at the nations to the east, the nations to the west, and you'll find that they won't do that. They have idols, and they won't leave those idols. And yet, Judah, you have the living God, and you left him. This is a challenge from God to see how foolish they are. Judah, look at how foolish you are. You can look at these pagan nations, and they haven't even committed the evils and abominations that you've done. That's a pretty serious challenge from God. Okay, look at these pagan nations and see if anything like that has happened here. But just a little bit of background on Kittim and also Kedar. Kittim was actually the land, like I said, for Cyprus. Okay, so up there in the Mediterranean Sea there. It was first ruled by Greece and then Assyria, and then actually it was finally ruled by Rome. And I'm just giving you some history because I like the history of these places. Kind of gives me a little bit of knowing where they came from. The people of Kittim can actually trace their roots back to Noah's son Japheth, Genesis 16, 2 through 5. So they're connected with Japheth. Genesis 10, 2 through 5, not 16. Genesis 10, 2 through 5, so you can look there. It's also mentioned in the prophecies of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 27, 6. It's mentioned in Isaiah 23, 1 and 12. And also in Daniel 11, 30. Kittim is also in the intertestamental writings. So you've got the Old Testament and the New Testament. Then we've got those 400 years of silence where we don't have anything. It's actually mentioned in some of those writings. Like, for example, 1 Maccabees talks about it being the land of Alexander the Great. So it is mentioned there. The Dead Sea Scrolls, they actually contain several references of it. And what's interesting is the Dead Sea Scrolls actually contain the defeat of the people there, the Romans, at the hands of God's people. That's interesting. You know what took down the Roman Empire? It was Christianity. Christianity actually destroyed the Roman Empire from the inside out. That's an interesting study to do, but that's really what started most of it. But then Kedar, real quick, means mighty, dusky, or black in reference to their skin or to their tents. Kedar was actually the second son of Ishmael, Genesis 25:13. And then later uses of Kedar are mentioned. The area south of Palestine, east of Egypt. We mentioned that, Genesis 25:18. They're described as nomadic, living in tents, Psalm 125. They tended sheep and goats, Isaiah 67. They were led by princes, Ezekiel 27:21. And they were famous for their archers, Isaiah 21:17. So they were great warriors. And they were also a very important people because Isaiah talks about them being one of the leading nations, Isaiah 21:16. So those nations were actually very important, but they just represent all the east, all the west. Look to them. Can you find such evil in those nations, Judah? And the answer was no, that Judah was actually the worst. And that's a sad, sad thing indeed. But thank you for your time this morning.